Listen-only mode.
Good morning. I want to welcome everyone back to day 2 of our basic training. I have just shared on my screen the agenda for, let's see, let me scroll down, that's the agenda for yesterday. Here is our agenda for today. And so hopefully you can see that on the screen. And just give you a quick rundown of where we're going. I'd mentioned yesterday that we are going to start off with a lot of the technical information around server specs, installation of the software, other components that need to be available, which databases to choose, how to know when to choose those databases, things like that. These questions come up a lot, and it definitely has a lot to do with the decisions that you make as you get everything put in place. Once we go through those considerations and we walk through an install, the rest of our time this morning and into this afternoon is going to be about configuring that. So it's going to be about how do you set up the mFile server software, as far as getting users in there, groups in there, scheduling backup jobs, and so on. So we're going to walk through all of that, where the goal at the end of this course should be that you feel comfortable and confident enough to do an install on a customer server, get that server software set up and functional, and create a good metadata structure for them, which is what we were working on yesterday. So with the homework assignment that will go out in the email after today's session, if you follow that, you should be more comfortable with a metadata structure, and with today's activities of installing and configuring the server, you should be in good shape for doing that. And if you're not feeling that at that point, then that would be a time to contact us and let us know what you're having problems with. We can help you through that. So are there any questions on anything that we covered yesterday? Anything that may have come up since then that we need to talk about before we jump into today's topics? Okay. Again, we'll just leave this open for questions. As I said yesterday, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Want to make sure that we're getting everything covered as completely as possible so that it makes sense to everyone. So you should now see up on the screen the technical data sheet for version 10. This is posted on the website in the technical information and brochures section. You'll also see it in Partner Portal, so it's available to you both places. You'll also receive a link to, I think I said this yesterday, a link to training material. So this is part of that as well. So we're going to walk through some of these specifications. If any of you are familiar with version 9, I will point out some of those differences as we go along. If you have not used 9 and are only using 10, that will not make a difference to you, but there are a few considerations to keep in mind. Okay, first of all, looking at the client side. So we're talking about the mFiles client and the mFiles server. The client itself can be installed on Windows 8 and 8.1. There's a difference right there, is that version 9 will work on Windows 8. It does not work with Windows 8.1. So if you are in a situation where you need version 9 clients installed for someone, even if you're installing a version 10 server, which is possible, you can run the version 9 client on a version 10 server. You can run a version 10 client on a version 9 server. So if you run into a situation like that, then just be aware that version 10 client will not, or I'm sorry, version 9 client will not run on Windows 8.1. But with version 10, you've got 8 and 8.1, 7, Vista, and then the Windows Server 2012 and both 2008 versions. On Windows Server side, you have essentially the same thing. Windows 8 and 8.1, Windows 7, Windows Vista, the same server versions, except for it will also run on Windows Server 2003. Now, looking at the differences between the server and the client side, the mFiles 10 client will not run on Windows XP, and it will not run on Windows Server 2003, and that is just because of the different architecture and the Internet Explorer versions. The new Windows 10 client requires the different architecture that's available in the newer operating systems. So you'll see right below that where we said that the 10 client is not compatible with Windows XP. That's a situation where you can install 10 server and 9 client if you have any XP users. And that could be mixed and matched within the environment. So you could go ahead and install the version 10 server. You get all the benefits of version 10 in that way, and even install the 10 clients on anyone that has these workstation operating systems that meet those requirements, and then just install the version 9 client for anyone who is still on XP. For those of you who don't know, in April, I believe it is, Microsoft will no longer be supporting Windows XP, so hopefully some of the people who have dragged their feet and are still on XP, maybe that will help push them forward, and even this will not remain an issue. Okay, and then Mac and Linux users can, of course, access mFiles using the browser-based interface. So the web access, which we will walk through here in a little bit as far as installing and configuring, they could always use web access, but the client itself, of course, will just install on Windows operating systems. It is available in 32 and 64-bit. When you download it, you make that choice as to which one you want. I can tell you that if you install the 64-bit version, it's possible to switch it to the 32-bit version. And usually the reason we would see a need for that is if you are trying to connect to other databases and you only have a 32-bit ODBC driver available. So we talked yesterday about the ability to connect to other databases if you have that ODBC driver. If for some reason it's only available in a 32-bit version, then your mFiles version has to match, because a 64-bit program will only see 64-bit ODBC drivers. A 32-bit program will only see 32-bit ODBC drivers. So if you have a situation like that, it is possible to install the 64-bit version, switch it to 32, and make the connection that you need without having to go through an uninstall and reinstall. There's a question about running IIS in compatibility mode. I think that I have seen that run okay, but I can't think of any issues where that was a problem of running IIS in compatibility mode with the web browser. Okay, let's look at processor and RAM requirements. We'll go through some of this pretty quickly. The minimum is an Intel Pentium or Celeron processor and a gig of RAM. That is just like if you read on any software specs, tells you what the minimum is, that absolutely does not mean that's what the recommended is. But having said that, that means that it is virtually impossible to find a machine at this point that you couldn't install and run M-files on, at least from a trial standpoint. So, pretty much anybody wants to download and install the trial, it's going to work for them. But, of course, in a production environment, those are not good specs. So we'll drop on down to the recommendations for up to 50,000 objects. That's where you need to be looking at 1 or 2 Intel Xeon processors, 4 gig of RAM, and RAID 1 or RAID 5 disks. So I'll make a couple of points here. First of all, on the 50,000 objects, the old spec sheet, and I requested this change and got it put through, the old spec sheet actually said 50,000 documents. And it's important to note that it's the object count that matters here, not just the documents. I say that because you could start with a blank vault for someone and connect it to their CRM database, their HR database, their ERP, and so on, like we were talking about yesterday, and import as many as 50,000 customers and vendors and projects and employees, etc., and end up with 50,000 objects in that vault and 0 documents. So that might just be a starting point for a company, is to get all of that data loaded and made available in M-files and not have a single document in there yet. So when we're talking about these recommendations and looking at number of objects, realize that we're talking about total objects. So that could be 50,000 documents and no other objects. So maybe you don't have any customers, employees, and so on loaded in. Or it could be exactly the opposite, that you have all of that data loaded and no documents. The reason that matters is because of the searchability. As you start putting users on this vault and they're searching for this information, it has to process those metadata objects regardless of whether there's a document attached to it or not. Okay, so that's the first thing to point out, is making sure that you're considering the total number of objects and not just the total number of documents. The second thing to point out is on this RAM size, where it says 4 gig of RAM. I like to make the distinction, and there is a notation a little bit further down in this document, that actually has to do with the database requirements and not the M-file server overall. Now, if you're using M-files with the Firebird database, then that's all going to be one and the same, because the Firebird database engine is going to be running on the same server with M-files. So any of these RAM requirements are going to make sense in both cases. However, if you were to move to a SQL Server environment, and if that SQL Server is on a different machine, then you could have M-file server running on one machine and your SQL Server database running on another machine. These RAM requirements really speak more to the database requirements, not M-files itself. The M-file server is only going to require about 1 to 2 gig of RAM, regardless of the number of objects, users, and so on. So as long as you have 1 to 2 gig of RAM available on the server where M-files is installed, you should always be okay. You need to then take into consideration whether your database is on that same machine. So in the case of using Firebird, that's why this would jump up to about 4 gig. If you look down below, going from 50,000 to 1 million objects, we go from 1 or 2 processors to 2 or 4. We go from 4 gig of RAM to 16 gig of RAM, and you need to be looking at a 64-bit operating system as well as SQL Server 2008 or 2012. So at this point, this 16 gig of RAM should really be attributed to the SQL Server and still only having about 1 or 2 gig of RAM for the mFile server itself. So it's important to make that distinction that these requirements really relate to the database and not the mFile software itself. Because the software itself, as you see as the minimum requirements, at a minimum it requires 1 gig of RAM, but at a maximum, mFiles only requires about 2 gig of RAM. Okay, there was a question, would you not generally recommend separating the database machine versus mFiles and or the web machines as a best practice? Well, it depends on the size of the environment. I mean, that's always a best practice if, you know, resources are not, resource availability is not an issue, those resources being money as well. Of course, in the smaller environments where people don't have as many servers, and so then in particular, they probably don't have as many users and can run on the Firebird database. That Firebird database engine is always going to be installed on the same machine with mFiles. Now, you could store the database file on a different server, and that could be a best practice right there. That's only going to give you a division of the files versus the software, but it's not going to do anything for you performance-wise. I might even argue, and I don't know this for a fact without testing it out, but I might even argue that your performance could degrade because you're running the Firebird database on one machine and then you have the database file itself out on another machine, which could have to, you know, be accessing that across the network. But scaling that up, most SQL servers are going to be dedicated machines. And so at that point, I'd say absolutely, you're going to have SQL on one machine and mFiles on another machine. Then we can talk about the web portion of that, is do you put the IIS server on even a third machine? And typically the answer to that would be yes as well. Okay, another question is asking about production in a virtual environment. That is completely possible. We have people doing that all the time. Now again, with SQL Server, you know, a lot of times people are going to dedicate the physical server to SQL, even if it's running, you know, maybe a couple of virtual machines inside of it. But that's not a requirement either. It's just dependent on how you want to divide that up. So sure, you could dedicate a single physical box for mFiles and split it into, let's say, 3 virtual servers, one running mFiles, one running SQL, and one running IIS if you wanted to split it up that way. All right, then finally, there's the recommendations for more than 1 million documents is definitely 4 Intel processors, 32 gig of RAM, again, attributing that to the database itself, which should absolutely be SQL Server at that point, and running on a 64-bit operating system. Now, there's a big difference between 50,000 objects and 1 million objects, and those questions come up all the time is, you know, how do we know and when should we be moving from Firebird to SQL? And there isn't just a hard and fast rule because there are so many different situations that or circumstances that can go into making that decision. For example, if I had 500,000 objects and 10 people accessing it, I can all but guarantee you that they're going to be fine on a Firebird database. On the other hand, if I had 250,000 objects, so half the number of objects, but I have 2,000 people accessing them, I could also all but guarantee you that your performance is going to be much less than what you would like, and it would be time to move to SQL. So you need to balance your user count with your object count, look at your network requirements, the size, the resource capabilities of that particular server. There are a lot of things to take into consideration. As a general rule, I would tell you that when you start to get in the 25 to 50 range of users, you're probably going to be looking at going to SQL Server. I can tell you that once you start to get into the 500,000 range in terms of objects, you will probably want to be looking at SQL Server. That's not always just because of that object count or just because of the user count, but more than likely because of the combination of those two, is that as you get to the 25 to 50 users, the activity in M-Files is probably so much higher that there's a much higher object count. And in the reverse situation, as the object count is going up, that's probably because of the number of users. And so when you put those together, somewhere around the 25 to 50 user range and around the 500,000 object range are going to be kind of benchmarks for you of starting to look at making that decision. That doesn't mean that, we have absolutely had people with lower object and or user counts move on to SQL Server, maybe just because they already have it in their environment, so they would rather use that, or they're doing things that are pretty intensive and they know that they're going to get better performance by making that move. And on the other hand, we've had people with well over 500,000 objects stay on Firebird. So again, that's just kind of a benchmark guideline to keep in the back of your head, but all of this should just be considered on a case-by-case basis to know exactly what's going to be the best decision moving forward. Okay, disk space requirements for the M-File server. And where it says M-File server, I have to, again, distinguish between the database and M-Files itself. So the M-File server software is only going to take 1 to 2 gig of disk space. You'll, of course, need space for page file, temporary files, things like that. So you're probably going to want to have, I don't know, I would say at least in the 10 gig range for M-Files on the server, just for some free space for programs to run well. However, when we start looking at the database portion of that, you can see that generally speaking, we're looking at about 2 gigs of disk space for 100,000 objects and about 20 gigs of disk space for 1 million objects. That is also going along with the idea that I said yesterday of probably an average of 5 to 7 metadata properties per object. So a little bit fewer properties, you're going to have a little bit less space, a few more properties, a little bit more space. But I think you could see that those are not really large databases considering the number of objects that are in there. It's also pretty linear, is that 2 gig for 100,000, multiply the space by 10 and the objects by 10, and it equals out. So, those, again, are going to be pretty good guidelines. Now, you might have 30 gig instead of 20. You might have 15 instead of 20. But, you're not going to be looking at 50 or 75 gig instead of 20 gig. So, again, those are some good guidelines to go by when you're looking at resources on the server that need to be available. Okay, file data. This is another thing that comes up all the time. How much space do we need for files? And that's something that no one can answer, because if you tell me that you're going to store 10 files, my question is, what kind of files are they? If you're going to store 10 Word documents, then I might tell you that, 10 meg or 20 meg is enough, again, depending on what's in the documents. If you tell me you're going to store 10 video files, I might tell you that you need 10 gig and not 10 meg. So it's not about the number of files, of course. It's about the size of the files, what the file is. And so you're going to find environments where people have extremely different combinations of files that they have, and the amount of space that they take up. Two things that I can say on this as far as file size, though, is that you will not be taking up any more space with M files than you're already taking up. So if you can look at their file server, and let's say that they have a 500 gigs worth of files on their file server, you can be absolutely assured that it's still only going to take 500 gig once you move it to M files, if you just take it straight over. The other thing that you can probably bet on is that with some cleanup prior to moving to M files, you should be able to take up less space in M files. So whatever they're using right now is just a maximum of what would happen in M files. But in an ideal situation, you could take up less space. There's two reasons for that. One would be cleaning up duplicate files. As we were talking about yesterday, it's going to be extremely common to find the same file in multiple folders if you're coming from a file server situation. So if you can run some type of deduplication on the file server and clean any of that out prior to moving to M files, there will now not be a reason to have multiple versions of that file in M files. If we had it in 5 different places on the file server, we will still be able to find it 5 different ways in M files, exactly the same, but only having one copy. So, if those are some big files that you can reduce multiple copies of, then of course you're going to be doing very well for the customer to save some disk space. The other thing that you can be sure of is that as people have been maintaining multiple versions of files, if you can, from that deduplication standpoint, convince them to dispose of any older versions of the files, you can kind of draw that line in the sand and start again from day one right now, moving forward in maintaining those file versions. And as we talked about yesterday, the way M-Files does the versioning, it's this binary delta algorithm that looks at the contents of the file and only keeps the changes as it goes from one version to the next. So if, let's say, they have 10 versions of a file on a file server, and they agree to only move over the last version, then obviously you're saving space right there by not moving everything. But further, as they start saving additional versions going forward, you know that they're not going to be multiplying the space requirements in the same way that they have. So you can save them some space and moving everything over by taking that approach, but you can certainly save them space going forward as well. So they're not going to see the same growth percentages that they have in the past, just because M-Files is not going to be storing multiple versions the same way that they have done it in the past. And it's also not, the people are not going to have the need to save multiple copies in multiple locations. So let's say that a company has been looking at a 10% growth rate in storage. You can all but guarantee them that that growth percentage is going to drop. no matter what, just because of not saving multiple copies and not saving multiple versions in the same way. Okay, are there any questions on that? We've covered a lot of information so far, looking at the server specs and how the database works, how the file data works. Are there any questions about any of that before we continue on? Okay, there's a question, does M-files deduplicate? There are, yes, I mean, I can quickly answer yes. There are a couple of ways that that can happen. One is there's a registry setting that you can apply, and the registry setting can actually be applied on a per file type basis. So it's looking at the extension of the file and the program or the process that was used to create it. So you can deduplicate on a file type basis so that when you save that file, it can actually look for other file names of that same file type created by that process. So at that point, it's strictly looking at the names of the files. You'll see a similar functionality that's already turned on in M-Files if you were to save an email into the vault and then you or someone else tries to save that same email into the vault again. It's going to tell you it already exists. It will allow you to save it. It's just going to ask you, are you sure you want to save it again? So that's the first thing that can be done. The other thing is there is some code that can be run as new objects are saved, and it will actually do more of a binary check on the file. So it's looking at a hash of the information, and it will look at the file date and time, created information, and the actual contents of the file in a binary format to determine if it looks to be the exact same type of file. So yes, that can be done. There's a couple of different ways that it can happen, but it is possible. And you could run that against the vault at a different time, but those are just scripts, so the scripts can then be customized to make it work however you want to. It may be that it runs the script and generates a report or outputs some information that you just review and then are able to clean the documents up later. Okay, so let's move on with the database engine and data storage. Some of this we will have talked about already, but we want to throw a few more concepts out here. So we've talked about the M-File server, including the Firebird database. Because it is an embedded database, that's why it's going to exist on the same server with M-Files. There is a way that you can install it so that it is separate if you really wanted Firebird completely separate from M-Files, but we typically won't see that because customers who are using Firebird are usually smaller customers and don't really have the need, the desire, the resources, etc., to split it or have a particular need to split it. But in any case, because it's included and embedded, you're not going to need to purchase any other database software. The metadata is going to be stored in that database, and the file or the data file objects are going to be stored in the file system. So all of the files are actually stored in file folders in the file system. They are renamed, so they're not recognizable. If whatever you name a file, you're not going to go out to the file system and see it named that way. It's also going to be, the extension is going to be a .bin, B-I-N file. So if it's a Word document, it will not appear as a Word document in the file system. Now, M-Files is controlling all of that, and I mentioned yesterday that M-Files does not change the file format itself, which is true. controlling those file names in the background, but if you were to take one of those bin files and name it properly for the extension, it would open in its native program. From an administrator standpoint, that directory structure should certainly be protected, but being on a server, normal users would not have access to it, and it will just be part of the back end of M-Files. But in a Firebird situation, data is stored in the database and the files are always stored outside the database in the file system. So with SQL Server, we can work with SQL Server 2005, 2008, 2008 R2, or 2012. We've talked about that just providing better performance, larger repositories, supporting more users, and so on. It does support all of the editions, which includes the Express Edition, Standard, and Enterprise. So let's talk about those editions for a second. The Firebird database is actually more powerful and can do more than SQL Express. SQL Express has a limit of 10 gigabytes for the database, which is actually a pretty large database for Firebird. I mean, just looking at this size up here, as we were talking about, if a 20 gig database supports 1 million objects, then a 10 gig database is already at 500,000 objects, generally speaking. So putting that in Firebird, that's starting to get on the high side, or I'm sorry, putting it in SQL Express is starting to get on the high side. So being in Firebird to allow you to go over 10 gig is not really that much of a benefit. However, SQL Express will only allow you to access 1 gigabyte of memory. The Firebird database will allow you to access 2 gigabytes of memory. And as you start pushing that threshold, you're going to want that additional memory to be available for the database itself. So I would never, we've had people say, well, can we run on SQL Express instead of Firebird? And the answer is yes, but there would be absolutely no reason to do it because it would essentially be like downgrading your database. There is one situation where I would say you should use SQL Express, and it's not to use it as the Vault database. It's if you have the reporting module, but you are running on the Firebird database. And so the reason is when you have the reporting module for M-Files, it does require SQL Server reporting services. So if a customer already has SQL Server installed, then they're probably running that as their Vault database anyway, and so they also have reporting services available. But if you have someone who's running on the Firebird database and they now want to use the M-Files reporting module, they're going to have SQL reporting services. Or rather than having to move them from the Firebird database to SQL database, which is going to require more licensing on the SQL side for them, you could actually install SQL Express with the advanced option, which includes reporting services. That way their Vault can stay in Firebird, but you now have SQL Express installed to use for that reporting engine. So it's a much cheaper way for a smaller client to get the benefits of the reporting module without having to install full SQL Server and move their Vault over. So that's the only time I would look at ever using the Express edition. A Standard and Enterprise, of course, are much more powerful than Firebird, so when you get to that point of needing to move, you're going to want to go with one of those two options. Now, the data is always going to be stored in the database. The data files can actually be stored in the database or in the file system, unlike Firebird where they are always stored in the file system. I would suggest that you always put them in the file system. It's really just not a good practice to put them in the database. Some people have wanted that. Some people will do that. I wouldn't advise to do that. So I would have SQL Server work exactly the way Firebird is, which is installing them or keeping them stored separately. And then there's a statement down here at the bottom that's talking about having a separate file server and mFile server, and that's where it talks about a different processor and RAM requirements on the mFile server could be smaller than indicated above. And that's exactly what we were talking about up here, is the fact that these specifications are actually smaller when you're talking about the mFile server itself. These are specifications if you had it all on the same server. Okay, there's a question that says, is space for the file system included in your recommended disk for the server or for the database? No, it's not, because we can't know at all how much space a customer's files are going to take up. I mean, I might have one customer with 500 gig and another customer with a terabyte and another customer with 100 gig. So the database size is going to be dependent on the number of objects, so that's going to be the combination of those data objects and the file objects. But beyond that, you know, again, 100,000 objects is going to take up about the same amount of metadata. It's going to take the same amount of metadata space in the database, regardless of whether those 100,000 objects are all data objects or all document objects. But once you start talking about 1 million document objects, I have no idea how much space those are going to take, because every file could be different. Somebody's asking about max file sizes. There is no maximum file size. Anything that you can store in Windows Explorer, you can store in mFiles. So same thing as, you know, file save as, drag and drop, bring it in through a hot folder. It's going to take in any file size that can be stored within Windows Explorer. Okay, another question asking about failover or redundancy servers. Are there any issues you should know? With failover or redundancy, I mean, there are so many different ways that that could be done. We have some people who have done that. If they have, let's say they have an on-premise server and then they put another server in a colo, or, you know, their own cage or rack space, something like that. With the replication features that are available, you can always replicate from one vault to another. So that's where we have some people who would replicate their vault from the on-premise location to the off-site location. And with DNS entries, the user can be addressing that mFile server just through a DNS alias. And if server 1 goes down, that DNS alias could just be repointed either manually or automatically through that failover and have it kick over to the other mFile server. So that's what you would get more from a business continuity type standpoint, is that you could either you know, have another mFile server instance running on-site. You could put it off-site. It could be in the mFiles cloud, which is on the Azure servers. However you want it, it could be spread across all of those different environments for a failover type situation. More for disaster recovery, you're certainly going to want to take backups of the database or backups of the entire vault, including the documents, and make sure that those are off-site as well. So then we can be talking about, you know, if you did replicate to another server, your backups are not going to be nearly as important, because you can fail over to another server that's essentially live as an as in within the past 5 minutes of anything replicating to it. From a backup standpoint, though, of course, you'd want to back that up, maintain it off-site, and be able to restore it to a server at another time. All right, any other questions about those topics? There was a question about licensing. I'm not sure if I have mentioned this part. In a situation like that for licensing, let's say that you had 30 users. Let's say you had 30 named users in your on-premise environment. If you did want to replicate that to another vault, whether it's on-premise or at another location as a failover, the way that would be priced is you would have the 30 licenses on the primary server, and then you would purchase an additional server license for 30 users. And so you can't take the license code from server 1 and just place it on server 2, but you can have another license code for server 2 that will accommodate those 30 as part of a failover. In a situation like that, you're not paying for 60 licenses. It's not 30 on one and 30 on the other. It's 30 on the first one and then a relatively small fee to have that second server available. Okay, let's finish out going through this document. So network communication. The client installations will communicate with the M-File server through TCP port 2266. That is configurable, but that's the default port and is also a registered port. So you will not typically find anything else running on port 2266 that is a conflict. The web clients use HTTP or HTTPS, also configurable. Of course, with HTTPS, you'd have to get your own SSL certificate and install that on the IIS server. Network address translation supported, virtual private networks are supported, so you could access your vault through a VPN when you're off-site without exposing any of that to the internet. If you choose to expose it to the internet through HTTPS, that's perfectly fine too if you want to do that, because you would already have the SSL certificate helping to secure that. It is also possible, one thing that's not mentioned on here is using RPC over HTTPS, which would actually allow you to connect your M-Files Windows client to your M-Files server across the internet without a VPN. So it is a secured encrypted connection because it's going over HTTPS with that SSL certificate. It does not require a VPN though. So without the virtual private network, you could still connect from your M-Files client to your M-Files server without requiring a VPN. And if any of you have used or are familiar with the cloud solution, that's exactly how it works. We have the M-Files server running in the cloud, which of course we are not directly on that network, but you can still run your M-Files client software connected to the cloud as though it's local. So it's using that same technology to do that. That's exactly what you get with Outlook when you are able to send and receive email and connect into your domain work network without having a VPN connected. It's able to connect to your Exchange server through Outlook without having a VPN. So that RPC connection with Outlook is exactly the same thing that M-Files is doing if you choose to enable that. And then some of the special environments, we do support terminal services, Citrix, Linux file servers, and Novell networks. With the Linux file server, just keep in mind that is not saying that mfiles runs on Linux. We're talking about just the files themselves. Some people have run mfiles on a Windows server, and because the files and the database can be separate, they'll run mfiles on a Windows server, SQL on a Windows server, but they store the files on a Linux file server. So that's a possibility as well. Okay, user authentication. We can do Windows authentication or mfiles authentication. So with Windows authentication, they're getting authenticated with their Windows account, username, and password. So this would be coming from Active Directory. We can also use mfiles authentication, which would be a locally created mfiles account, not one that has anything to do with your Windows account. This is exactly the way SQL Server behaves, if you're familiar with that you can have Windows authentication where you're bringing in an Active Directory account, or you can have a local SQL user. So all of those go in as login accounts. And you can mix it. You can have some mfiles, some Windows, and have both on the same server. Okay, database connections we've talked about many times, the ability to integrate with other databases like CRMs and ERPs. Just requires the ODBC driver, and we've talked about SQL Server, which would be all versions, Access, Oracle, MySQL. This would also include Excel, other Firebird databases, so there's a lot of options here. It is rare that we run across a database that we're not able to connect to, and that's really just going to be because it's a much older one or something that's really out of the ordinary, not including an ODBC driver. Okay, application programming interface. So mfiles does include a full API supporting languages of VB.NET, C#, Visual Basic, VB Script, and C++. So you're able to actually control mfiles, the documents, the objects, exactly what's going on in mfiles from an external program. It's the same language that you would use in VB Script in mfiles itself if you wanted to do any customization that the user interface doesn't allow. So, watch the deduplication that I was talking about earlier. Deduplication is not something that you're going to find in a menu option in the administrator, but you can insert some code into the vault that watches for those files to come in and then checks them against the files that already exist. So that's how that portion of the deduplication would work, and that's all taking place with the API. There's also a web service API. It uses a REST-like interface and will allow you to integrate through web applications with the mfiles server as well. So all of the documentation for the API is included with the mfiles software. So if you look at the M down in your notification area and right-click it, there's a documentation link, and the mfiles API information is right there. You'll also find it in the Start menu. So all of that is available to you already. If you want information on the mfiles web service API, it is on the mfiles website. If you go to the same location where the technical documents are located, there is a link to this information. Finally, there is also a UI extensibility framework which will allow you to customize parts of the interface, particularly the right-hand side where you normally see the metadata and the preview pane, is that you can insert other applications into that to run customized functionality. We've had people that integrate mapping functions over there so that if you were to choose a customer object, for example, it could show you on a map that's integrated with Google Maps on the right-hand side where that customer is located. You can customize that metadata area in any way that you want to with the UI extensibility framework. That's absolutely a much more advanced topic, but we do have some people that are doing that a little bit more and more if they want to present a more customized user experience for the users. Okay, backups and maintenance. mFiles is automatically going to optimize the Vault database once a week. You don't need to do anything else. That's going to be if you're running on Firebird. You will need to schedule backups, so you should do a system of full and differential backups, and we'll look at that in this afternoon session as we're doing some more configuration on the server. But when you do backups for Firebird, they're going to be backed up with the mFile server administrator. And that backup will include the Vault database as well as the document files. If you're running on SQL Server, that optimization job is still going to be running once a week, but you will actually use the SQL Server tools to take a backup of the database, and then you can use any other third-party file system level backup tools to back up the documents. And then, of course, all of that should be backed up to some other media and preferably off-site. So whether you're using Firebird or SQL Server, you will either have the Firebird backup, which is all-inclusive as a single file, or you'll have a SQL database backup and another backup of the files themselves, and all of that needs to be backed up separately to, as I said, some other media and preferably another location. Okay, there's a question. Noticed yesterday that I had a Microsoft GP server object. Is that a standard direct interface? There is a Microsoft GP integration that's available. It is an additional piece that can be included with consulting hours. So no, that's not something that you would normally see. What you're referring to is right here, there's a Dynamics GP. These are all just different vaults that I have for my particular demo environment, but the GP integration can absolutely be included and offered for sale to customers. All right. And just an answer to this, there was a question about whether the interface was designed something like GP just because of that integration or trying to go that way for partnerships. It really didn't have anything to do with that. We really just took some of the functionality of mFiles that already existed, looking to modernize it. And one of the things that I mentioned yesterday was also just kind of allowing that extensibility for moving forward, is to be able to do some other things with the interface that would not have been possible in the old 9 interface. But no, it's not tied to that partnership opportunity at all. All right, any other questions before we get into the installation portion? Okay, we're going to start running through an install of the software. I'm assuming that most, if not all of you, have installed this at one time or another. So there's a single MSI installation file, and this can be deployed through group policy if you want to, and then obviously it could just be run standalone on a machine. Very simple to run, not very many options to choose from, but we are going to look at a couple of options in this situation that are going to be different because I am showing you the installation of, so obviously I already have M-files installed in this environment. What I'm going to show you is what it looks like to install M-files if you were installing a version different than what already exists. And the reason for that is because you get several other options available. Installing this, I'll talk to you about installing it the first time, but I'm going to show you what it looks like if you are upgrading or installing some type of update. So of course we're just going to accept the license agreement, and then here is the option for the evaluation. So I'm sorry, this is actually what you would see if you were installing it the first time. You could either choose evaluation version or normal installation. So the evaluation version is going to install everything on the single machine. It will include the sample vault and my vault. If you're doing this will work without a license for 30 days. So this is exactly the trial version, and it's going to install everything with the sample vault and will work for 30 days. Now you can then convert that trial to a full version that does not expire by just installing the license. In most of your situations, you will be going with the normal installation. And with a normal installation on a client computer, the M-Files client itself is all you will normally need. You might want to install the M-Files server tools on that client computer if you're doing it for an administrator. So if it's someone who might want to connect to that server to administer the M-Files server, then they would need those server tools available. And then, of course, the M-Files server itself would just be installed on the server unless you're also doing it on a desktop for some testing purposes or something. Now, you'll see that M-Files client was already checked because that's installed on this machine. If I wanted to install all three components, I could check those. The option that we're not seeing here, and I'll tell you how this would be different if we were trying to install a higher version than what we already have. Instead of it saying evaluation version right here, it would offer the option of a simple upgrade. And most of the time, that's the option that you're going to want to choose. A simple upgrade looks at what you have installed right now, component-wise, which would be any of these three components, and it will upgrade, it will install the upgraded version of the exact same components that you already have. That is the simple upgrade. It's going to install those components, uninstall the older components. So let's say whether you were going from version 10.3 to 10.24 or from version 9 to version 10. If you do a simple upgrade, it's going to look at the components you have and upgrade them, period. And it moves everything from that older version to the newer version. If you don't want to do a simple upgrade and you want some customization capabilities, then you would choose if we were installing a higher version, this would say custom installation. It would look the same, and you would have the option to choose which components you want. So if you were doing this with a higher version, this would say simple upgrade, which you could choose, And at the bottom, you would still see this grayed out showing you which components are already installed, and it would upgrade just those grayed out components. Or I could choose what would then say custom installation if this were a higher version, and I could pick and choose if I wanted to add or remove certain functionality. When I go to the next screen, if I'm doing an upgrade, it will ask me then if I want to migrate everything that I have and if I want to uninstall what I already have. So again, let's say I'm going from version 9 to version 10. If I choose to migrate it, it's going to take everything that's on my version 9 server and move it to my version 10 server. It would also take all of my client connections from version 9 and move them over to version 10. The next option that would be a checkbox is whether to uninstall the old version. So both of those are checkboxes, which really gives you 4 different options. You could tell it to migrate and uninstall, which means if you're going from 9 to 10, it's going to move everything from 9 to 10 and uninstall 9. You could choose neither option, so that you don't migrate and you don't uninstall. That would be like leaving version 9 as it is and go ahead and install version 10 with a completely blank slate. You're not moving anything into 10 and you're not removing 9. So it is possible to run or to have multiple versions of M-Files installed. You can only run one server on a particular computer at a time, but you can run multiple clients at one time. So I could have a version 9 client connected to one server and a version 10 client connected to another one. That's why those options exist. So I could migrate and uninstall, I could not migrate or uninstall, or I could choose various options of that. Maybe I want to migrate from 9 to 10, but I don't want to uninstall. That means I'm going to upgrade everything I have, but I want to leave 9 installed for some other purpose. Maybe I need to leave it on for testing. So, as I said, when you're doing all of this, you would either have the simple upgrade or you would have the custom upgrade, and you'd be able to select any of those options. Once you do that and you click next again, and it's just going to run straight into the install. Only a couple of options to choose. You just need to be aware of which options you want for moving forward, but a couple of options to choose that give you that ability to then run multiple versions of M-Files on the same computer if you need to, or not to move it from one version to another. All right, are there any questions about that? Can't actually, I mean, if I ran the install, all we would see is the splash screen showing the progress. That's essentially all there is to it as far as actually running the installation. You're just going to double click it, choose the simple install or the custom install, and tell it where to go and click next, and it's going to take care of all of it for you. The ports that we talked about port 2266 and so on. It's going to open the ports for you, and all of that's going to be connected. Okay. All right, there's a question, can we restore our backup to a new version? Yes, you can. So a couple of things to say there. If your vault is still live in an older version and you do the upgrade, if you choose the migration option, it's going to move it from the older one to the newer one for you. and we'll upgrade the vault at that time. We'll actually ask you if you want to upgrade the vault, but you need to upgrade the vault if you're going to use it in that newer version. If you restore an older version, then when you get that old version restored into the newer version of the administrator, there is going to be, and I think I can show this, there will be an option under, yes, under operations that says upgrade. It's going to say upgrading a document vault makes it incompatible with older mFile server versions. Are you sure you want to upgrade? So that's something to keep in mind. Once you do the upgrade, you're not going to be able to use it in the older version at that point, but you can do this. And if we say yes, in this case, it's going to say the vault is already the latest version, so it doesn't need to do it. Alright, so now that we're in the server, this is where I was going next anyway, let's start talking about how to configure this environment. When you start this up, if you start the server administrator from the server itself, then you will already see a connection to the mFile server, and this will say local computer. That's what it's going to look like if you start this from the server itself. If you wanted to administer the server from a remote computer, which is essentially what I'm doing here, because yesterday I was talking to you about the demo environment, I'm on a workstation in the demo environment connected to a different virtual server. And so that's why we saw my server name up here that I'm connected to. You will actually need to establish that connection yourself if you're doing it from a remote computer. The way you do that is right-click on Connections to mFile Server and choose New Connection to Server. This is going to be just an identification name, whatever you want this to show up as, like it does right here in mine where it says mfdemo srv01. The server name is what you are then going to have to type in. So this can be the name of the server on your network. It could also be a fully qualified domain name for that server. So if you do it that way on your own network, or as we talked about, the ability to connect to a cloud server, you would need to connect to the cloud server by putting in that fully qualified domain name. The port number typically is going to be 2266. If you were connecting to a cloud vault, it would be 4466. And instead of the TCP/IP protocol, you would change that to HTTPS. So we talked about that on the technical data sheet, that our cloud vaults are using HTTPS on port 4466, which is how and why you're able to use that without a VPN connection. Alright, then you can test the connection to the server if you want to, and then under Authentication you'll tell it how you are connecting to that mFile server. So you'll be connecting to the mFile server with a user account that is a system administrator. And by default, the person or the user that installs mFiles will be the system administrator for that server. So your account will already be added as a logon account. If you want someone else to be a system administrator, you can add their logon account. If someone needs to be a system administrator instead of you, you can add their logon account as a system administrator and then either remove yourself or that other person can remove you. So it can all be changed after you get it installed, but whoever installs it by default is going to be that first system admin. Alright, so once you see the connection to the server and you click on that node, over here on the right hand side, you will see the various things that we need to start configuring for this new server. The first thing that we need to do is put a license in here. So if we click on license management, in this case you can see all the information about my license already that is installed. But if I don't have anything here, if this screen is blank, then I can go to install license. I'm going to put in a serial number for that license, and then I will put in the license code, and it's going to look something like this. It will be several lines long. It may stop here, or it may be even longer depending on everything that you have purchased, the number of licenses and different types that you purchased, as well as the company name, the modules, and so on. All of that will be encoded in this license file. So in buying a license file from mFiles, you'll receive an email that contains this information, so you can just copy and paste it in there. The serial number and the license code itself. The license code's obviously very long. Don't try to type that. Just copy it from the email and paste it right into this box. When you do that and click OK, it will take you back to the license management screen, and everything should have refreshed at that point to show you exactly what you have. You should be able to see your serial number, a company name, when your license and subscription expires, and then you'll be able to see the number of each type of license, how many named, how many concurrent, how many read-only. You'll be able to tell how many of those are in use or assigned or logged in. And then down here you'll be able to see which modules you have. So whether you have the OCR module, e-signing and compliance, or reporting, possibly all of those in this case. But once you've installed the license, everything looks okay, you can click OK, and then you're finished with that portion of it. So the next section is going to be setting up notification settings. What you're doing right here is just telling mFiles how to communicate with your mail server so that mFiles can send out email notifications as it needs to based on what's going on in the user interface. So as something is moving through a workflow, for example, if that workflow is creating an assignment, and so maybe it needs to notify the user of that assignment to them, then it would send it through this mail server. It may be that you're receiving reminder notifications or any other types of follow me notifications that you may have entered. Then it's going to use these server settings. So first of all, you will come in and click Enable Notifications. You will type in the name of your SMTP server. In my case, it's on the same server. I'm talking about this demo environment. It's on the same server as mFiles, which is the one we're already connected to. So we just type in that server name. In the same way, though, this could be a fully qualified domain name if you had an email server that is out on the internet, a shared hosting server or something like that. You can also set it for using an encrypted connection. Gmail is one of those that you do have to use an encrypted connection, as opposed to some other servers that do not require that. So you might need to check this box depending on your particular mail server. And when you check it, it's going to default to port 587. If it's not checked, it defaults to port 25. But this is configurable, so we could do this on a non-standard port if we wanted to for our own server, or it may be that if you have an internet provider of your mail server that you need an encrypted connection, but it's not 587, it might be 785. So you can configure that however you need to. You may need to turn on SMTP authentication in order for emails to go out. And again, that is a function of your email server. It's whether or not it's set that way. If it's hosted, it is very likely that it is set that way. And so you would need to turn this on and provide an account name and password to connect to that server in order for these emails to be sent. And that's really just to prevent spam so that someone can't send a bunch of emails through somebody's server when they don't even have an account on that server. So in this case, we say, okay, you have to provide your account credentials in order to be able to send the email. All right, and then you can specify a sender's email address and the display name. These can be anything that you want it to. Display name could say mfiles notification. It could say system administrator, whatever you want that to say. And even the email address is just anything that you want it to be. It, at that point, does not have to be a valid email address. It can just be anything that you want to display, so that when this shows up in the user's inbox, it's just showing who it came from as whatever you put as the display name, and then the address as the other portion of that. So if they actually replied to it, maybe you just want that reply to a notification to go nowhere. And then finally, the digest message time. So when notifications get sent out, there's two different types of notifications. It can send an immediate notification or a digest that is a collection of multiple notifications all at one time. So an example of this would be if I wanted to be notified of all new documents that were saved to the vault, and I wanted to be notified immediately. If 100 documents got saved to the vault in a day, I would receive 100 different emails letting me know that a new document was saved, and it would have a link to that document. If I chose the digest message, instead of 100 separate emails with a link to each of those documents, I would get a single email that referenced all 100 documents in the one email. So the digest is just taking all 100 of those individual notifications and putting it together as one. Now this time is the time that that digest message will be sent out. So if 300 messages have, or I'm sorry, if 100 documents have been saved in the last 24 hours, then since 10 o'clock last night, that's what would show up in my digest message. So here we're just specifying what time it's going to come out. Now if you have multiple vaults on the server, realize that everything that we're doing right now, the licenses, the notifications, etc., is server-wide. So if you had 5 different vaults on one server, whatever you put in here, that's going to be the time that digest messages are sent for all of the vaults. All right, any questions about this? Setting up the licenses, setting up notification settings? All right. Okay, our next topic is configuring web access. This particular topic has several steps. They're detailed in some instructions that will be available to you. There are several things to do here, so you'll just have to follow along with how to do this and then realize that it's actually documented in these steps. So in order to configure web access, just to be able to install the website, you need to meet 3 prerequisites. The first one is that IIS, or Internet Information Services, must be installed on a Windows server. It does not have to be on the same computer as M-Files, but IIS must be installed somewhere. You must also have ASP.NET version 4 or higher. Currently, I've been installing version 4.5 and it works fine, so just 4 or higher is fine. And the third thing is you will have to register that ASP.NET to work with IIS. So we're going to walk through all 3 of those prerequisite steps and show you how to do all of this. So as I said, I'm connected to a virtual server. I'm going to log into that server because it is on that server where I must install ASP.NET and IIS and get it registered. All of that is going to take place on the server itself. So there was a question about the ASP.NET or IIS. The version. I was referring to the ASP.NET version, which must be 4 or greater. And in our case, we'll be doing 4.5. All right. Let me close this down. So I want this to be full screen. Okay. All right. When you are on your server, if you see IIS already installed, that's just one less step that you have to take. We're going to assume for the moment that it is not installed, just so I can show you what it takes. You would just come in here to add roles, click on next, and find the web server IIS role. You'll check that box and click install. It's that simple just to get IIS installed. Now, it does look different if you are doing this in a desktop operating system versus a server operating system. The general pieces of it are the same, but it does have a little bit different presentation. So if you're doing this on a desktop operating system, you would still go to, in that case, you would go to Control Panel and go to Programs and Software, I believe it says, and you would click to install Windows components, and IIS would be one of those components. So I'm showing you the server version because in most cases that's how you'll be doing it. Just realize if you do this on a Windows desktop, it will appear a little bit differently. So when you get IIS installed, you will come back to this screen. You'll see Web Server IIS right here. And then what we're going to do from that point is click on the Web Server IIS to take us to the screen for it. And if we scroll down, you'll see Role Services. These are the different components of IIS that we can select. And so we'll need to go into add role services. I can all but guarantee you that all of the ones that you need for this will not have installed by default. So I'll show you which ones you need in particular. First of all, you will need to check application development. More specifically, you're needing ASP.NET, .NET, etc. But if you check the box for application development, it will check this whole tree, and you will need all of that in order for it to run properly. The next thing that you're going to need is to check or at least make sure that dynamic content compression is checked. If that box is not checked, your website, when you go to log in, will not look right at all. You will know immediately that dynamic content compression is not on, because the website is going to look very text-based instead of the graphical mFiles logo. When you go to log in, it will not present the login screen to you correctly at all. So you want to make sure that dynamic content compression is turned on. And then finally, under management tools, turn on the IIS-6 management compatibility. Click that to turn on that entire tree. So that's three things that you need to make, three different role services or main role services that you need to make sure are enabled in IIS. The first one was the application development portion. The second one is under performance. Make sure that dynamic content compression is on. Static needs to be on as well, but that one is usually installed by default. So just make sure, I guess I should say, make sure that performance is checked so that it gets both of those. And then the third option is to make sure that IIS-6 management compatibility is checked. That's going to make sure that all the components are available and installed in IIS for the website to install properly. Any questions about this, about getting these features or components installed? I have not seen any rhyme or reason to whether or not the server is going to require a restart after this. I have had certain servers want to restart after I install IIS. They might then want to restart after you install the particular services. Other times they don't. So that may be dependent on other components that already exist on that server. I can't say that for sure. The reason I'm bringing this up is that while the install itself may be safe to do during the day in a production environment, you may not be able to ultimately complete it if it's going to require that restart, because you may not be able to do that during the day. So it may be safer to, schedule say a 15 to 30 minute maintenance window if necessary, knowing that you could be bringing that server down if it has to be restarted. And that would go for this portion, as well as when we get to the ASP installation, because in doing ASP, there's always the chance that it could require a restart at that point too. All right, so after we have IIS installed and we have the particular role services installed, the next thing that we need to do is install ASP.NET. So if you go to the Microsoft website, upper right hand corner under search, we'll type in download ASP.NET. And hopefully this will return fairly quickly. And you're going to be wanting to download, as I said, ASP.NET version 4 or later. So that is not going to be the same thing right there. This may be it, ASP.NET 2, 3.5, and more. Let's try this one and see if it has a link to version 4. Doesn't look like that's it. One thing about Microsoft's site is that they can change things from one month to the next. So sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to find exactly what I'm looking for. Let's try that search a little bit differently. Let's try download ASP.NET 4.5. There we go. Download Microsoft.NET Framework 4.5. So this takes us to the Download Center. We can click on Download, determine how you want to, well, I'm going to skip version 11 right now. That's what it's trying to get me to do. Do you want to run or save? I will always just run it. So it's going to run ASP.NET installer. That should complete. Again, prepare for a restart. May not require it at that point. But this is simple enough just to install 4.5, install ASP 4.5. The last step that you're going to need to do is to register that ASP.NET with IIS. And the way we do that is to go to a DOS command prompt. When you do it on the server, you're going to need to run that command prompt as an administrator. So click on Run as Administrator to bring up your DOS prompt, and we're going to go into the following directory. This is going to be in Windows, Microsoft.NET, and then it's either going to be in Framework or Framework 64, depending on whether you're running a 32 or 64-bit operating system. In most cases, your server is probably going to be 32-bit, so you can go to Framework 64. Then we're going to go into the version directory for ASP.NET, and we're going into version 4. If I just type a CD space V4 and hit Tab, the tab will finish out the name of that directory, and I don't have to remember the exact version number. And when I hit enter, it takes me into that directory. This is where I'm going to need to run my command to register ASP.NET. And the command that I'm running is ASP.NET _ regiis.exe space I space dash I space dash enable. And if we hit enter, it's going to tell us that it's starting to install it. Gives us a few dots, and it will come back and tell us that it's finished. Takes no time at all. That's the command line that you're going to want to run. Now, taking a step back for a second, in the mFiles Server Administrator, if we click on Configure Web Access, and we have not done those 3 prerequisites, if we have not installed IIS with the correct components, if we have not installed ASP.NET or if we have not registered ASP.NET, this component is going to yell at us. It's going to put up message boxes and tell us what we haven't done. It's going to say, you have to install IIS. You have to install ASP.NET. It will even give you that command line that we just ran. Now, it's not going to tell you which directory you have to run it from, but it will tell you this right here, ASP.NET _ regiis -i-enable. However, as I said, the instructions on configuring and installing this will give all of this to you, but you're not going to be able to continue in the mFile Server Administrator if you haven't completed these prerequisites. So are there any questions now on those three pieces? IIS, ASP, or registering ASP? All right, so we will exit out of here. We can now close down our server. We'll just log out of this remote session. And now that we're back in the mFile server, we can click on Configure Web Access, and it will take us to this screen. This is a screen we would have been looking for from the beginning and had to do those prerequisites first to get it to this point. All right, so we have three options now when we're installing the mFiles website. We can modify an existing site, we can create a new site, or we can create a new virtual directory. If you have just installed IIS, so I was assuming that none of this stuff existed so that we can show starting from scratch. Going into a customer environment, who knows? They may already have IIS installed and they're running 10 different websites. If you just installed IIS, then the only option that you're going to see under modify an existing website, it's going to say default website, which I don't have the default website anymore because I'm already running IIS. But if you just installed IIS, default website is going to be in this drop-down list. There's really no reason that you couldn't install it right to that site if you're doing it in a new environment. For training purposes, I'm normally telling people that when you don't know anything about the environment you're going into, and particularly if IIS were already installed, you are not going to want to modify an existing website unless someone can tell you for absolute sure that that website is not needed anymore, because you are going to overwrite it. So the default website, when IIS is first installed, you're not going to need that. You could overwrite that. In the case of an existing environment you're going in, someone may be able to tell you that a particular site's not needed and it's okay to override it. More often than not, it seems like you go into environments and somebody set this up and somebody else set that up, and people don't necessarily know everything about their configuration. And so you want to use this option with extreme caution to make sure that you're not overriding a site that still needs to be there. So this is an acceptable option. It's just one with extreme caution unless someone can give you enough information on the environment you're going into. The next one is to create a new website. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. You're not going to overwrite anything. You're not going to ruin anything that already exists by creating a new website. However, if there is another website that's already running on port 80, or any port that you specify right here, it's going to be a problem unless you take some additional steps. So again, we get to an issue of needing to know something about the environment. Is there another website running on port 80 or any other port that I might specify? If so, which site is that? Can I modify it, or do I need to modify this one? So you can install to a new site, and you can either run on an unused port, so we could type in port 8080 or 8081, or we could run it on port 80 at the same time and modify the host headers of the site. Again, that gets to be much more technical in IIS, and maybe you don't want to go through all of those steps. So the last option is the safest, and it requires the least information. So going into a customer site, you don't know the environment, and no one else can really tell you the environment either. This is definitely going to be your safest option, your quickest option, and one where you can get it installed and move forward and not really have to rely on what someone else may or may not know about the environment. What you're doing here is you're going to select a website that already exists. This is the same list of websites that we had up here that we could have modified. The difference is that up here it would have overwritten that site. What this is doing by creating a new virtual directory is it will create a directory inside that site called mfiles. And so the way we access the site at that point is to go to this main site with a / m-files, or whatever you want the name of that site to be. So that's actually the way that the site was installed in this demo environment. It is on, you see that, or I'm sorry, it was actually installed to its own site called MFWA, which is what would have gone in right here in the name, and then it was on port 8080 because something else was already running on port 80, and that was the SharePoint site. So I will typically go for this option right here, is to create a new virtual directory. That way I don't have to mess with the ports. I don't have to know what ports are already in use. I can just use the port that this site is already using without having to modify anything, and then just put in my own name right here that's going to be a virtual directory. Okay, there was a question that says, is the 8080 modifiable, or is it because you currently only have 80 as being used? Yeah, the 8080 is modifiable. That, like I said, the way this was installed, it would have been, it would have looked like this when it was installed. That would have created a brand new site for the mfiles web access and put it to port 8080. I could have done port 80 normally, but in this case 80 was already in use by the SharePoint site. So I had to pick something other than 80 unless we were going to get into modifying host headers in IIS. So, you know, for those of you who are familiar with IIS and website configuration and ports and so on, you're absolutely free to go do that, and that's why these options exist. If you're not familiar with it, then that's why I direct you to this third option, because you don't have to know anything about IIS. You just choose a site that already exists, and you're essentially making a folder within that site. So if I were to click OK right here, it would install the mfiles website into that directory, and it takes all of about 3 to 5 seconds. You'll click OK when you do that, and you'll see the screen disappear and it will be installed. You should then just be able to start up a web browser and go to that site that you just chose. So in this case, when I open this up and it goes to my server's site on port 8080, which is exactly what we told it. And it brings up this mFiles web access site. Now again, if we didn't have the dynamic content compression on, this would be very text-based and all crammed up here at the top. So you'll know if something's wrong there. But once you have the web access up and running, you should be able to log into it with your user account. In this case, it's going to prompt me for which vault I want to use, which is exactly like it does if you go into mFiles through the client side. You have to choose which vault you're going to access before it takes you into the mFiles client. So in this case, I have to choose which vault I'm going to use. Then it will load up the web client for me. It takes me into the vault. We are not going to spend time in this course going through web access. Generally, it's very much the same. I mean, you can see just from this interface alone, it looks very much like the Windows interface. It does not include a preview pane at this point, and the metadata right now will show up on the bottom instead of on the side. So if we go to a document, you'll see the metadata showing at the bottom instead of the tabbed interface on the side, and it doesn't show the preview. Several other things I think are kind of more power user type options and maybe even administrator type options that you won't find in the web client that do exist in the Windows client. But at this point, you can see that our web access is up and running. We can double-click a document to check it out, and it will open that document in Word for us just like it would normally. I can then close that document and check it back in and log out of the vault. It's going to take me back to my login screen, and I can close this down. Okay, there's a few questions. If a client only has one vault, will it take them directly there? Yes. Whether I'm using the Windows client or the web client, if I click on mFiles, instead of it taking me to a vault selection, it would take me straight to the Windows interface for that vault. If I were in web access, when I log in, instead of it presenting me the list of vaults, I would log in and it would go directly into the vault without any selection at all. Okay, next question says, so it means that by configuring the web access from my desktop from home, I can access the server from home. I mean, whichever machine you're configuring that web access on, where the mFiles server is, then yes, you would be, well, okay. So what we've done right now is we've configured the web access on the server, which has it up and running and accessing the vault. Now, some people want the web access available only internally, and I think I mentioned yesterday that we have some customers who are Mac only. Well, they need the web client, and they might be in a situation where they only have the web client available internally. If you want to make the web client available externally, then there are some other things you have to do that don't have anything to do with mFiles. It just has to do with DNS settings with your hosting provider for your domain and some changes on your firewall. On your firewall, for example, you would have to open the port that you installed this on. So in our case, we installed it on port 8080. So we'd have to have port 8080 open on our firewall. Or you would have to open port 80 if that was the one. Now, if you're going to expose it externally, I would strongly suggest that you use an SSL certificate, which means you purchase the SSL certificate and install it into that website in IIS, and then you would actually be using port 443, which is the HTTPS port. So you'd have to have that port open on your firewall and pointing or redirecting, it's called a port forward on the firewall, that will send that traffic from the firewall into the correct mFile server. So like I said, it doesn't have anything to do with mFiles at this point. It has to do with your network configuration, DNS settings, SSL certificates, which is all just standard information as far as configuring websites and port forwarding firewalls overall. Okay, another question was asking about a thumbnail in the bottom left. It is a thumbnail view. It's not the same as the previewer that we have in the Windows client. And so, it's not expandable or anything. It's not going to give you the best view of any content in that document. But it was a small thumbnail view in the lower left corner. All right, any other questions about the web access? All right, then we'll go ahead and wrap up. We're at the end of our session right now. We'll take a 2-hour break and come back at 1 o'clock Central. When we come back, we're going to continue on this screen right here for login accounts, and then we're going to start getting into some of the various components of the vault. So we're going to go from login accounts into our users groups and so on, and continue covering the rest of the configuration of the server and the vault structure. So we'll have a good break, and I'll see you back here in a couple of hours. I am going to shut the webinar down again as I did yesterday, and so we'll just restart from the same link when it's time to begin again. So we'll see you in a little bit. Thanks.